Have you ever stopped for a moment, looked at the trajectory of your life, and allowed a terrifying truth to settle into your bones? The realization that if everything stripped away tomorrow, if you lost your job, if your relationship shattered, if your health failed, if the very foundation of your existence collapsed, there is a highly probable chance that absolutely no one is coming to save you. Your friends are burdened by their own fragile lives. Your family is entirely consumed by their specific, relentless dramas. The comforting illusion of a support system is often nothing more than a carefully manicured mirage that evaporates the precise second you desperately attempt to lean your full weight against it. For the vast majority of human beings, recognizing this intense, profound degree of isolation is paralyzing. It triggers an ancient biological panic. From an evolutionary standpoint, to be separated from the tribe meant certain death. Therefore, we spend nearly all of our waking hours frantically attempting to stitch ourselves to other people, desperately attempting to ensure that when we inevitably stumble over the cliff of misfortune, there will be hands reaching out to catch our mangled bodies before they strike the ground. But what if I told you that this desperate clinging to the illusion of salvation is the exact poison that is slowly destroying your potential? What if the singular reason you remain weak, malleable, and relentlessly dissatisfied with your existence is that you have never allowed yourself to truly feel the crushing weight of absolute isolation? Carl Jung, the architect of analytical psychology, postulated that a human being does not truly mature in moments of being understood. A human being only genuinely matures during the agonizing moments of having to remain entirely with oneself. The moment you cross the violent river of hardship alone, the exact moment you recognize that there is no savior waiting on the opposite bank, is the very moment you ignite a dormant, monumental source of inner power. Today we are going to tear apart the comforting lie of the collective. We will venture deep into the philosophies of Carl Jung and Friedrich Nietzsche to understand precisely why isolation is not a punishment, but an initiation. We will dissect the psychology of the loner, and we will reveal why a period of utter social starvation is fundamentally required to forge an unbreakable mind. If you are exhausted by placing your psychological safety in the hands of erratic, unreliable people, then it is time to turn away from the crowd. Walk into the wilderness with me, and we will discover how to construct an empire in the dark. To fully comprehend the extraordinary power of isolation, we must first dissect the slow, subtle violence of the crowd. We have been conditioned by a deeply neurotic modern society to believe that constant connection is synonymous with emotional health. We are relentlessly instructed to find our tribe, to network, to surround ourselves with positive people. We are terrified of Friday nights spent completely alone in a silent room. We view an empty calendar not as an expanse of beautiful freedom, but as a chilling indictment of our social worth. However, Friedrich Nietzsche perceived the crowd through an entirely different lens. To Nietzsche, the herd was not a source of strength. It was an aggregator of magnificent weakness. The crowd operates through consensus, compromise, and an aggressive, low-level demand for mediocrity. Whenever you submerge yourself in an environment filled with people, a quiet, almost imperceptible negotiation of your identity immediately begins. You unconsciously adjust your opinions so they are not too abrasive. You moderate your ambitions so they do not highlight the devastating failures of your peers. You laugh at jokes you do not find amusing. You agree with political or philosophical stances you secretly detest, all to avoid the agonizing friction of standing entirely apart. This constant, daily micro-adjustment demands massive quantities of psychic energy. Carl Jung termed this psychological currency libido. Every single time you adopt a persona to appease a specific social circle, you are bleeding libido outward. You are hemorrhaging the very energy required to build a monumental life, squandering it on the pathetic endeavor of simply maintaining an acceptable image. Think about a time you walked away from a superficial social gathering. Did you feel energized? Did you feel a surge of powerful, dominant clarity regarding your life's ultimate purpose? Or did you feel subtly drained, hollow, and vaguely dissatisfied? That hollow sensation is the feeling of your psychological capital being siphoned away by the herd. Jung warned that the process of individuation, the magnificent journey toward becoming your absolute, undivided self, cannot possibly unfold amidst the cacophony of the collective. When you are constantly situated in environments where everyone fears the same localized failures, worships the same petty social status, and regurgitates the exact same cultural talking points, it becomes mathematically impossible to distinguish the voice of society from your own authentic, internal voice. You easily and disastrously confuse the consensus of the mob with the fundamental truth of your soul. Absolute isolation strips away the audience. It brutally cuts the electrical cord supplying power to your performance. When you are placed in an environment devoid of any external validation, devoid of any social judgment, of any immediate positive or negative reinforcement, your carefully constructed persona abruptly collapses because it no longer possesses a function. The mask shatters against the floor of an empty room, and it is entirely within this terrifying, echoing silence that the actual, terrifying work of deep self-construction finally begins. When you finally step away from the noise, or when the noise brutally steps away from you, as during a severe tragedy, a vicious breakup, or an explosive career failure, you enter what Carl Jung chillingly referred to as the night sea journey. This is not a vacation. This is not a retreat where you sip tea and journal about your positive affirmations. The night sea journey is the psychological descent into the dark, uncharted waters of your own unconscious. This is the precise moment when the numbing agents of the matrix are entirely removed. You cannot text your friends to distract you. You cannot drown yourself in the superficial validation of social media. You are trapped in the claustrophobic submarine of your own mind. And it is precisely in this pitch-black ocean that you will finally encounter the Leviathan, your own repressed, terrifying shadow. As long as you are continually surrounded by people, you are afforded thousands of brilliant mechanisms to actively evade facing your own darkness. You can flawlessly project your own insecurities onto someone else. If you are fundamentally disorganized and chaotic, you can find a partner to meticulously manage your life, allowing you to remain a massive, irresponsible child while masquerading as a free spirit. If you are deeply terrified of taking actual risks, you can embed yourself in a social circle composed entirely of equally paralyzed individuals, engaging in a mutual pact of comfortable stagnancy. But when isolation strictly enforces a total quarantine, the shadow completely loses its ability to hide in the projections. It violently surfaces. This is why the initial phase of true, unadulterated isolation is experienced as profound agony. It is not necessarily because you miss the specific people who abandoned you. It is because you are suffering from catastrophic withdrawal due to the sudden lack of psychological painkillers. The jealousy you spent decades insisting you did not possess, it begins burning a hole in your chest. The profound regret regarding monumental life decisions you aggressively rationalized away, it screams at you at 3 a.m. The terrifying realization that you are entirely, 100% responsible for the catastrophic position you currently occupy in life, it pins you to the mattress. This is the exact juncture where 99% of humanity completely fails the test of isolation. Unable to endure the serenely honest gaze of their own shadow, they violently panic. They immediately run back to the herd. They will text absolutely anyone, rekindle toxic, dead relationships, or consume staggering amounts of superficial distraction just to extinguish the unbearable silence. They successfully escape the night sea journey, but in doing so, they completely abort the birth of their own higher self. They remain psychological infants, endlessly dependent on the external environment to dictate their emotional weather. But if you possess the excruciating courage to plunge your entire being into that darkness, if you choose to sit utterly still in the middle of an empty room while your anxiety, your regret, and your terror detonate like mortar shells inside your consciousness without reaching for a distraction, a profound alchemical transformation initiates. You begin to realize that the monsters residing in the darkness are not actively attempting to kill you. They are attempting to communicate with you. Your anger is signaling clearly where your fundamental boundaries were violently violated while you possessed a weak persona. Your profound sadness is demanding that you grieve the illusions you foolishly traded your authentic years for. Your desperate desire for control is revealing your absolute terror of the unknown. When you cease running from these internal psychological elements, they gradually lose their terrifying appearance. You integrate them. The massive, chaotic energy required previously to fiercely repress them is suddenly liberated, flooding back into your conscious mind as pure, unadulterated psychological fuel. You no longer require someone to comfort you, because you have finally become an individual capable of walking through your own personal hell without burning to death. Once you survive the confrontation with the shadow during the initial agony of isolation, the entire landscape of your reality fundamentally shifts. You transition from Carl Jung's psychological integration directly into the brutally demanding territory of Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy of self-overcoming. Nietzsche famously proclaimed that God is dead, signaling the catastrophic collapse of objective, externally provided moral frameworks that gave society comfortable, ready-made answers. In a world devoid of an ultimate, divine safety net, just as in a life completely devoid of a dependable support system, human beings are faced with two distinct choices: succumb to absolute, paralyzing nihilism, or engage in the monumental task of becoming the Übermensch, the overman. To become the Übermensch is the ultimate goal of absolute isolation. It is the active, deliberate construction of your own values, your own meaning, and your own unbreakable source of power. When no one is actively cheering you on, when absolutely no one is holding you accountable, and when no one genuinely cares whether you succeed gloriously or fail miserably, why do you continue to work? Why do you wake up early when the world is dark? Why do you meticulously refine a skill when there is zero prospect of an immediate audience? If your motivation was entirely anchored in receiving praise, securing a promotion, or merely proving your critics wrong, it will shatter into 1,000 pieces within the first few months of genuine isolation. Those motivations are heavily reliant on the existence of the crowd. The Übermensch operates on an entirely different source code. They are not fueled by external reaction. They are driven by the raw, unadulterated will to power, operating as an autonomous, self-generating engine. In isolation, your motivation must undergo a violent transmutation. You must reach a point where you execute brutal discipline not because someone is observing you, but simply because the failure to execute would constitute a treasonous act against who you have chosen to become. This is the psychological state of total self-authorship. When you spend significant time entirely alone, you begin to ruthlessly dissect the beliefs that have been aggressively installed in your mind since childhood. You realize that nearly all of your perceived limitations are completely artificial, constructed entirely from the fear of social exclusion. In isolation, you are granted the horrific, intoxicating freedom to create a new character from absolute scratch. Do you want to become cold, ruthlessly efficient, and entirely impervious to manipulation? You can forge that character precisely because no one is present to consistently remind you of the weak, overly agreeable person you used to be. The crowd constantly attempts to pull you back into the exact shape they are comfortable with. Isolation is the fire that melts the old shape entirely, allowing you to pour the molten iron of your consciousness into whatever magnificent mold you furiously desire. Nietzsche understood that all great things are born in absolute solitude. The genius does not discover monumental breakthroughs by conducting a survey of the herd. The conqueror does not formulate a strategy for global dominance by requesting a consensus. They withdraw to the mountaintop. They inhabit the desolate spaces where the thin oxygen starves the weak and clarifies the strong. As you emerge from the crucible of this extreme, deliberate isolation, you will bring back a weapon that the majority of modern society finds absolutely terrifying, yet possesses a desperate, unspoken envy for. This weapon is the strategic armor of extreme emotional detachment. When you have thoroughly learned that you are entirely capable of surviving the absolute worst-case scenario, total, crushing abandonment, the threats of the modern world instantly lose their psychological bite. Understand the geometry of power in nearly all human relationships. Leverage is entirely predicated on a profound fear of loss. The manipulative partner inherently controls you because you are terrified they will leave, plunging you into the abyss of being alone. The abusive boss relentlessly exploits your fear of losing social status and financial safety. But what leverage does anyone actually possess over a person who actively seeks out isolation? What power does a threat hold against an individual who has already stared completely into the darkest, most desolate corner of their own psychology and emerged functionally intact? The resounding answer is absolutely none. This is the psychological superpower of the true master. When you do not fundamentally need anyone in order to maintain your internal equilibrium, your entire demeanor aggressively changes. You no longer engage in frantic people-pleasing. You no longer tolerate even the slightest degree of disrespect simply to maintain a fragile connection. You possess the chilling ability to walk away from any negotiation, any relationship, in any environment the precise second it ceases to align with your monumental standards. You develop what Robert Greene might term a formless emotional state. Because your identity is no longer intricately constructed around what others believe about you, an insult basically passes straight through you like a bullet through an apparition. You observe the frantic emotional chaos of the herd with the cold, detached interest of a scientist studying an ant colony. They are completely enslaved to their reactions. You are anchored in the deep, silent bedrock of your own total autonomy. To be clear, the goal of this journey is not to become a socially inept, perpetually bitter hermit hiding from the world out of fear. The goal is to return to the world entirely fundamentally changed. You can still engage in relationships. You can still love profoundly. You can still lead massively. But the brutal difference is that you are doing so from a position of absolute choice, never from a position of pathetic necessity. You no longer look at another human being to serve as your savior, nor do you look at them to serve as your mirror. You interact with them as a complete, sovereign entity. If they choose to stay, they are a welcome addition to your empire. If they choose to leave, the empire does not even register a micro-tremor. The foundation was never built on their presence. How do we practically construct this invincible architecture of isolation in a world that is designed to aggressively prevent it? How do we sever the intravenous drip of social validation and step fiercely into our own devastatingly powerful autonomy? The first law of the Shadow Protocol is to actively audit and burn your safety nets. This is agonizing. You must rigorously identify every single relationship or habit you utilize to avoid sitting with yourself. You must identify the specific people you instinctively text the precise second you feel bored, anxious, or insecure. Once identified, you must place a deliberate, calculated embargo on that behavior. The absolute next time disaster strikes or profound anxiety hits, you are strictly forbidden from outsourcing the psychological management of your crisis. You sit entirely still. You endure the violent storm inside your chest. You become your own completely indifferent, heavily stabilized anchor. The second law is the mandatory enforcement of strategic, absolute solitude. You must carve out large, expansive blocks of time where you are totally unresponsive to the matrix. This is not me time, spent watching a movie or aimlessly scrolling through the lives of others. This is a deliberate descent. You sit in a room without a phone. You go for a profoundly long walk in absolute silence without a podcast. You force yourself to confront the deafening roar of your own unedited thoughts until the initial panic subsides and the authentic, subterranean structure of your psyche is finally audible. The third law is the absolute obliteration of all external, validation-based goals. You must completely demolish every single plan, ambition, or objective that was fundamentally created to impress people you do not even respect. If you are ruthlessly honest with yourself, a terrifying percentage of your current life trajectory is designed solely for performance. Strip it entirely away. Discover the activities that you would relentlessly pursue, even if you were the last human being alive on a burning planet. When you lock onto those pursuits, you tap into the infinite wellspring of Nietzschean will. The fourth law is to embrace the brutal reputation of the lone wolf. When you begin to fundamentally change, the crowd will violently resist it. They will accuse you of acting cold, arrogant, entirely selfish, and unapproachable. You must understand that this is not an actual critique. It is a desperate projection of their own devastating insecurity. They are terrified because they cannot control you. You must let them believe whatever narrative comforts them. Never, under any circumstances, lower your terrifyingly high standards simply to assuage the discomfort of weak individuals. You wear their misunderstanding not as a badge of shame, but as the ultimate crown of your absolute independence. The realization that absolutely no one is coming to save you is the heavy, agonizing toll required to cross the bridge into true adulthood. For the majority, this realization shatters them perfectly into a million terrified pieces, reducing them to desperate victims, constantly searching for a new system or relationship to desperately cling to. But for the very few, for those who possess the raw spiritual violence necessary to look at the emptiness and decide to conquer it, this exact realization is the birth of empires. Carl Jung mapped the dark waters you must traverse, and Nietzsche described the monumental heights you can reach once you arrive on the distant shore. This is not a path for the weak, the performative, or those addicted to the cheap narcotic of being liked. It is the path of the absolute master segment of humanity. Stop looking at the horizon for a rescue ship that was never scheduled to depart. You are the captain. You are the storm. And you are the only salvation that will ever permanently matter. If this message resonates with the isolation you have felt your entire life, do not flee from it. Embrace the terrible freedom it offers. Subscribe to this channel to join the silent ranks of those who understand the dark psychology of true independence. Walk into the empty wilderness. What you find there will make you unstoppable.